I appreciate being here. This is a great opportunity for me to express my story and how it happened for me. And it comes after seeing this video, in which I stand by 100%, as well as Yo Soy El Army as far as the realities of the situation. I think it's important to get up and for you guys to be able to talk to someone who's actually been there and experienced it the whole time, and also go through what happened to me and how I joined and how I've come to different political conclusions because of it, how it's changed me and forged the new path in which my life has taken. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself and when I was recruited, which was out of Denver, Colorado, when I was in high school. I was just your average student. I came from a working class family who was in no way going to be able to pay for an education for me. And although I did okay in school, I never really applied myself enough to get the kind of grades that would require that would deserve or merit me any kind of scholarship or other way to pay for school. On top of this, I kind of had a burning need to get out and see some more of the world, which I'm sure a lot of different people could have had at the time and still do. And so I was pretty much a prime candidate for military recruitment, and it didn't take but a quick checkup online and putting my email address in before I was getting bombarded with calls from all the different services. And finally one night it was the Marine Corps who finally showed up at my house in their dress blues, looking fancy, looking professional, talking to my family. And I was 17 years old, and I was in the summer between my junior year in high school and my senior year, and that was pretty much all it took. Now, again, going along with what the film Before You Enlist has said, I was shown and partook in the kind of lies that were gonna plague the rest of my entire enlistment from the very beginning. The first thing that I was told was that I didn't have to sign the typical 8-year contract, which is 4 years active, 4 years inactive. I was told that because of the job choice that I signed up for, which is intelligence, required me to do a 5-year contract active duty, and then which I would do 3 years inactive. Now you'll imagine my surprise when I showed up to Intel school and I was the only one with a 5-year contract. But it was another kind of quota that had to be met. Recruiters get points in a sense of a system, whereas if they can get people to sign up for 5 years, such as myself, who was young and enthusiastic about joining, it was easy for them to convince me of something like this. But the lies didn't stop there. I was told when I signed up and then when I started helping out that any kind of drug use, or whether it be prescription or recreational, that I had been part of, or anyone that had come into that office should be lied about. That you shouldn't say these things when you're signing up, because it's going to hurt your chances of being able to actually go to boot camp. And they talked a lot about this famous moment of truth in which you get to boot camp and you have to stand up and under penalties of jail and massive fines state whether everything that you've said so far is true. And they said, you know what, if anybody stands up at that moment of truth, you're not doing what you should be doing. Everyone needs to stay on their butts and sit down. Now when I had joined, I was enlisted in the delayed entry program. And the delayed entry program is a way to bring in, and using hindsight as my advantage, is a way to bring in more recruitment help. Because I signed up in between my my summer of my junior year and my senior year, which gave me my entire senior year of college as a motivated basic recruiter's assistant. And they were able to use me and my friends and my entire network throughout my community as a helper, basically. And it didn't stop there. One of the things that I had particularly been involved in at the beginning was tutoring in order to help other people pass the ASVAB. Now, in order to pass the ASVAB, and the minimum score required is barely above 30%. In the overall score, so it doesn't require much, and it's a very basic sense. So according to the Department of Defense, anyone that can't pass that test has no business being in the U.S. military. Well, it's easy to get around that if you've got a few people that are willing to spend a few hours a week helping people with some math problems and with some of the basic algebra and reading kind of issues that would just help them pass that test. And I did that at the beginning with just a few of my friends. And before the end of my senior year, I was giving entire tutoring classes, which amounted to dozens of people that would have never joined the military otherwise, from working class communities and people that have already had the bad end of the stick growing up without an education and without even the means to graduate high school or pass the ASVAB. Now they're being sent off to war. And of course, when you sign up and you have a low score like that, there's no job choice whatsoever. You're automatically on the front lines. You're automatically going to be a grunt. A little bit later was because of this tutoring program, I was supposedly given rewards, which is a meritorious promotion and a $50,000 Marine Corps scholarship, which is one of the famous words of complete crap that you'll hear anytime you go into a recruiter's office. Is this $50,000? You hear all this money. Everybody's entitled to the GI Bill when they get out, and everybody has to put into it. This $50,000 was just a nice way of framing the exact same thing that you're already getting. And I'll go into later about how that wasn't even such the case. Now, when I first went to boot camp, my initial perception was that of, I'm sure, everyone else. You know, it was a radical change in which they were breaking us down. They needed to break down everything that we were before, to the point where we were even considered less than human. We weren't even a civilian. We definitely weren't a Marine at that point, but we were less than human, and it was their job to build us back up in the most robotic fashion in order to mold us and turn us into the robots in order to do the bidding that they needed. And that involved brutality that I had never seen before. And this was just in boot camp. This was before the war. This was in 2003 when I joined. And the brutality that I had seen in boot camp, I hadn't even seen in the movies. There was times when I remember drill instructors throwing full canteens of water and hitting a recruit in the head, splitting his head wide open, and that drill instructor was given about a 2-week vacation, and then he was back with us in the very next cycle that we were partaking in. There was the reaction from the recruits while they were in was also evident. You saw not only the hardship and what everybody had to deal with around you, but also with the people that had been in boot camp for a while, which we had considered been recycled. And people that, for instance, may have gotten injured or couldn't pass a certain stage. There's no kicking you out. They just keep you there. And you go back into the platoon behind you and you keep going. And seeing some of these people and their perspective after having been there for months on end, started to take a toll on other recruits, people that have been affected by it even more and were taking to the experience even harsher. While I was in, there were 2 suicide attempts within my own platoon. One of them was a close friend of mine who came out of Colorado, another individual who I helped join. He ended up, he slit his wrist one night, survived, and went home. The next time I had been promoted to guide of my platoon. And in the middle of the night, I was woken up because a second recruit, another one of my friends who I had met while I was there, had slit his wrist and was in the bathroom and almost died. But the recruiters were able to patch him up, and he didn't even leave boot camp. We saw him continue, and he just got recycled like some of those other, just like if he had a normal injury to his leg or something. The most traumatic time that I remembered was when we actually got to the rifle range, and someone who was already had it in their head that was the only way out turned the rifle on themselves in the middle of the rifle range and in front of everyone. And it was barely a break. It was barely a break in the training before we were right back out there the next day on the rifle range doing the same thing as if nothing had happened. So having gone through this process of breaking you down and building you back up, it became more and more apparent to me exactly what the purpose was. And it became more apparent as well with regards to the war as while I was in boot camp, the invasion of Iraq was happening. And everyone at the beginning was under the impression that this was going to be a quick war and that it was going to be fast and easy from the top. And this again shows the lack of foresight at the very bottom levels and the ideas that people had going into the war. And in fact, your drill instructors, who were supposed to be the most hardline people, never breaking face, never doing anything. At one point I had a drill instructor sit down in front of the whole platoon, took off his hat and broke down and began crying in front of us because he had been ingrained with this mentality that his whole entire purpose in life was to go to war. His father had been a Marine and his grandfather had been a Marine, and now that he was at a time when the Marines were finally going to get to go to war, he was stuck on drill instructor duty, training a bunch of young kids who he said were going to get to go fight the war that should have been his. Now, looking back on things, I'm sure he spent many trips to both Iraq and possibly Afghanistan. But it definitely shows you exactly what the mindset of these people were and the mindset that they were instilling upon us. Now, once graduated, I came back, and before having really experienced any part of the Marine Corps, I was given a 2-week vacation, which is what they called it, on recruiter's assistance. So I went straight back home, having just graduated, looking sharp and in shape, and they sent me straight back to the recruiter's office where I came from, and the first thing that they had me do was go straight back into the high schools. And I spent 2 weeks telling about my experiences, of course, not sharing anything of which I've just shared to you right now, bringing in even more high schoolers. So again, I was also, as we saw in the movie, I was also told that I wasn't gonna see combat, that even if we did invade, I had a desk job, which was intelligence, and again, another lie, far from the truth. I was in Iraq at the beginning of 2004, which was barely 6 months after I first went to boot camp, and we were marching from Kuwait all the way to Fallujah in a vehicle convoy. This took about 4 days, and we were the entire time that we were driving up, we had corpsmen, who were the Navy doctors that were attached to our units, feeding us ephedra and doing whatever we could possibly do to stay awake. And I began to realize on this first trip where we drove up how little prepared all of us really were. We had no idea what the culture was of the people that we were coming in contact with. We had no idea what our mission even was. The farthest out that we were looking was getting from point A to point B, and whatever happened along that way was up to us. And of course there were many firefights, there were many explosions and reactions that people were again unprepared for. Going back to the mission in creating a Marine, and what we were instilled with going out was again this dehumanizing factor of everyone else in the world. We were seen as the most elite, the best, the better than you of the entire world, and it was the American civilians that were right underneath us. Everyone else was less than human, and because we were told and ingrained in our heads that anyone could possibly be a potential threat and less than human, it made engaging and pulling your trigger and getting off of that vehicle second nature, and the first thing that was in your mental vocabulary of what you should be going for. And I noticed it from the very beginning. The perception from the Iraqis was far different than what we were told it was going to be as well. We were coming into contact with people that, through whatever possible interpreters we could get, were explaining to us the most basic needs. They had no electricity, they had no running water, they had no way of feeding their family, especially after the destruction and mayhem that had been caused for the past 6 months before we first started setting up shop and establishing our bases there. And this lack of communication and being able to understand the needs and the desires permeated the entirety of both of my deployments. From not just in talking and dealing with the local Iraqis, but also in our engagements, and when we came into firefights and conflicts with people that were resisting the occupation, and we began a series of detainments, and we started arresting people like it was nothing. It took very little. In fact, we knew very little. We had no way of truly knowing what was going on out there, and so the solution was arrest everyone and take everyone in. And it began with a terminology that the Marine Corps was using at the time called MAM, or military age male, and it kind of tells you exactly what their their goals were, or what their plans were as far as detaining people. It had nothing to do with who was there or what people were doing. It had to do with the threats and the resistance, and trying to minimize that using whatever means possible, and that meant taking people out. And it translated into all different forms of misuse or of abuse of the authority that we had in detaining and capturing people. I remember a lieutenant, and a lot of the times you can hear from a lot of veterans the stories of these young lieutenants, people that were my age that just happened to be in charge of a lot of people because they had a college degree and they were able to be put through school because of that. But were in no way more experienced, and in fact most likely less experienced than I was at the time. And I had a lieutenant that I remember in the middle of the night, after we had just arrested and detained about 15 people, screaming at the top of his lungs, bloody murder, shaking a local Iraqi that we had just captured, screaming in English to him, "Why are you shooting at us? Why are you shooting rockets at us?" And he had no idea what this lieutenant was saying, nor does the lieutenant have any idea what he was trying to get out of this situation. But it was a very it was definitely like a moment that shed some light on what our purpose was there, and how little we actually knew of cloudy things that may or may not be by design at the time. Were things like rules of engagement. It was easy for Marines and for soldiers to engage once they had been engaged, but the cloudy part of it was when you could fire before you had been fired on, when you could engage people supposedly involved in suspicious activity. And these were things that weren't ever explained to us, or if they were contradicted 5 days later and turned on themselves. We used other contradictions that I saw when I was out there were the use of tracking and cataloging systems. We used a computer system that all of these people that we were arresting and detaining, whether they had anything to do with an attack or not, we would put them into a system that scanned your retinal, your eyes, your fingerprints. It would take pictures of you and log and track when you were arrested, and solely for the purpose of having you in the system and justification if you were seen and arrested again, that they would have already some kind of evidence on you as being a resistor or someone who has anti-United States or anti-coalition sentiment. Again, adding up to enough evidence to throw people in places like Abu Ghraib without charging them or without anything like that for an indefinite amount of time. We were stressed in boot camp. We were told about the Geneva Conventions and these so-called rules or norms of warfare that the United States supposedly abides by. Yet when I was in Iraq, constantly did I find our units utilizing schools and hospitals and things that completely against the Geneva Conventions in order to conduct offensive operations from. In fact, my unit in particular was was utilizing an operation of undercover work, where we would dress up in local Iraqi attire. We would get into Iraqi vehicles with all of our gear underneath us, hidden, and then go out and patrol the streets in that way. It got to the point where it was just too obvious for us to be driving through in local or in Humvees and being able to show our force. So they began going in undercover operations, and again another radical departure from whatever the Geneva Conventions that the United States talks about are. The abuses and the contradictions went into the misuse of money and funds, and especially after I got back after my first deployment, which was in the winter of 2004, and I stayed for about 6 months in between two deployments. We were given a massive influx of money. This was when tax dollars were getting pushed into the military harder than they had been in decades, and we were given an authority or discretion in the way that we were allowed to use this money that had nothing to do with our missions at hand. In fact, I was in charge of a very small shop, but we used a lot of computers and camera equipment. And at one point between my two deployments, I was given a $100,000 budget. and told that if I didn't spend this money within 5 months, it was going to disappear. And so basically my orders were to spend the money. And I did spend the money, and I spent it on things that we didn't need, that we didn't care about. I bought computer equipment and high-tech things that we never even brought with us, because nowhere would they couldn't even survive if you took them to the desert. They sat in boxes. They were used for watching movies when we got back home, or for the people that weren't deploying. And it also translated into combat operations as well. In fact, on my second deployment, my unit, sitting in a base just outside of Fallujah, thought it great to have an idea of doing a combat hey-ho jump, which is a high altitude, high opening insertion into the combat zone. It was just another way of getting to where you were going, basically. Well, we did this hey-ho jump, which is at the expense of considerable resources, considering the training and the equipment that was used, the planes, to jump into an area in order to patrol about 40 meters from where we took off from. And then we all stood up in the middle of the night and held up signs saying that it was the first combat hey-ho jump in USMC history. You know, and it was just a way of cementing what we were doing and wasting more government funds. But it also kind of opened me up to the role of money and to the role of capital within the war effort and how much of a big deal it made. I started seeing a lot of more things on the news about how much money was going into the military, and it definitely illuminated the role of money. So, like I talked a little bit about my transition in between my two deployments, and I wanna show the difference between that and my transition out of the Marine Corps. When I got back from my first deployment with a lot of other people, I had a lot of money. My bank account was stacked fuller than it's ever been before, because I had been making money when I was in Iraq and hadn't been able to spend it at all. And I had no responsibility. I had gotten back with my fellow Marines with a sense of invincibility and recklessness that created problems in an immense proportion. On my first deployment, my unit only lost 1 Marine, and while I was back, due to drug abuse, DUIs, drunken motorcycle accidents, bar fights, we actually had 5 deaths and countless injuries just in the 5 months that I was back. And that was again repeated on my second deployment after we had replenished our funds and gotten more money and more recklessness and more of a sense of invincibility coming back from a second deployment. Now, as I transitioned out of the Marine Corps, it was pretty much the exact opposite. By this time, I had spent 2 years with no real financial responsibility whatsoever, wasting all of my money. I got out with no money, no financial responsibility whatsoever, and nothing but fear in front of me as to the bleak outlook in 2008 for the possibility of finding any kind of job. So basically, on my way out, I had 3 options. The first option, which is the one that the Marine Corps wanted the most, was re-enlistment, and they dangled a lot of money in front of my face. If I would have re-enlisted and gone back to Iraq and actually taken my oath and signed the papers in Iraq, I would have gotten a tax-free bonus that would have been almost $90,000. And this is a one-time thing. I would have only had to re-enlist for another 4 years. But the other caveat that they didn't tell you about was that it immediately would have required me to go once again back to either the drill instructors or the recruitment field, as those are 2 of the main duties that you have to do upon re-enlisting to continue your career. So that being through my experiences and through seeing what I had seen, it was exactly not what I wanted to do, was to re-enlist. And the other option by this time was to go as a private contractor. And the private contractors were things that I've seen a lot of my friends go to personally, and the amount of money dwarfs that $90,000. The private contractors are making so much more money, 6 figures, over and over and over again. Short deployments, sometimes no deployments. I've got friends now that are part of private contracting firms that aren't even in danger anymore. They're conducting operations from computers in the United States and don't even have to deploy, and doing that on a cycle and still making the same amount of money, the same ridiculous amounts of money as the people that are in these mercenary armies all throughout all theaters of war at this time. Again, not having those two options not be the ones that I was going for, the school option, which was the initial reason why I even joined the Marine Corps, finally became the only thing that I could go to. And so I was reliant upon the GI Bill and the benefits that were going to be awarded to me in order to make a living, in order to go to school, and problems with that began almost as fast as I had transitioned out. In fact, the GI Bill changed when Bush got out, and there was an addition to it, so it was more lucrative to switch to this new GI Bill. Well, this caused people to switch over who everywhere from Vietnam on, that were going to school or utilizing their GI Bill benefits, as well as their family members and anyone else who was on it, to switch over to this new GI Bill. Well, there was no preparation done for this massive change, and it resulted in everybody stopping receiving payments. Now, I had only been in school for about 4 months when this happened, and had no way of finding something else at the moment. And so myself, along with hundreds of thousands of other veterans, turned to whatever could possibly be turned to. In fact, I was in offices and I saw people my age and younger, homeless already, living out of their cars, not able to find a job due to the economic crisis and the crisis of capital that had already paralyzed the entire nation, and seeing exactly what's happening now to these soldiers who got out and didn't want to go back with the mercenary army or re-enlist back into the regular army. And it was another eye-opening experience that showed me the role that just last month, under the Obama administration, there was another amendment to the new GI Bill that stopped the break pay. So before, while you're in school or in a semester, you would get paid for the months that you weren't in school, as long as it was less than 6 months. And this is again part of the GI Bill and the way the GI Bill has been for some time. And now that that's been cut off, and so now it's again forcing veterans to find a job depending on whether they're in a quarter system like I am or a semester system, between 2 and 4 times a year to supplement what the GI Bill was supposedly going to be offering us. So having seen all of this and having experienced the treatment and of the veterans, and understanding the way that the society works with the militarism abroad, I've come to several conclusions about what needs to be done and what I can do with other veterans, as well as what we can do in our communities to bring about awareness and fight these policies and fight them. And I keep using the word imperialism as the efforts, both economically and militarily abroad, in order to finance capital. But that starts with capital here. And we've seen the amount of money and the fact that the military-industrial complex is one of the only things keeping the economy afloat in a time of desperate crisis, and as well as the extent in which the rest of the world feels the crisis in relation to the United States. And it's brought me to an internationalist viewpoint, whereas we have to be in solidarity with all the people around the world that are affected by these issues and by the imperialism that we have here, or the capitalism that we have here that manifests itself in imperialism abroad. And we have to fight this with solidarity with the working class and the oppressed people throughout the world. I saw, looking back on it, that we were the shock troops of imperialism. We were the people that were conducting this on the ground abroad, while the propaganda and the media and the mainstream news outlets are brainwashing the people here into thinking that what we're doing is good. And I think it's important at this point to understand what our methods are of fighting imperialism and using our international relations and our local connections in order to confront this. We need to be confronting recruiters directly. We need to talk to them in the schools, in the places where the career fairs where they go. We need to keep them from infiltrating our communities and going door to door. And we have to understand that there's a connection and a deep-rooted connection, as we're going to see a little bit more in the next video, with overrepresentation of Latinos and blacks within the military, and the fact and how they're targeted for recruitment in particular. And we have to understand the connection both with the militarism that our country is staying afloat with abroad, and the militarism we have at home and along our borders and in our communities with the police, and the fact that Army and National Guard and even Marines at times are used within our own borders as well as abroad. And it's important that we have an understanding of what it means to expose the targeting of Latinos and black, and expose the DREAM Act and what it means to have a component, the military component, alongside a supposed educational component that should have been the saving light of the DREAM Act. However, it doesn't show you that the schools and the public education system is under attack as well, showing that this education component isn't the other right, and that it is a general force of militarism in order to bring people into the military at all costs and whatever it takes. The connection with education and the attacks on publication is a vital and precise component against the war against, or in our fight against militarism, due to the fact that not only are people attacked and used and college is used as a way to get people to join the military, but that that education in general is becoming less and less of an option for everyone. The attacks against public education have been severe and are getting worse and worse, and tuition is raising. You have programs, ethnic study programs are being cut across the board. Classes in general of all sorts are being cut, and in general an education, which is the place in the youth and the place where most of our energy and optimism can come out of, is under the greatest amount of attack. It's important for us to understand not only the role of the youth and the role of different struggles such as education and such as labor struggles, but also what it means to be organized, and organized collectively within our communities with a connection both here and abroad. And it's what's drawn me to the organization that I'm part of now, and I've chose to work in building a revolutionary workers organization, which has a vital international component. We are called La Voz de los Trabajadores, and we're a sympathizing section of the International Workers League. And and from here today, with what I've presented to you, I invite all of you to join me and to join the organizers of this event and everybody who's here and putting it on in an overall, in a worldwide, starting at our most local levels, network of anti-imperialism, anti-militarism, and immigrants' rights in order to facilitate the struggle against oppressed people. Thank you guys for being here, and thanks for the organizers. And